In 2019, researchers analyzing ancient DNA extracted from skeletal remains inside a Neolithic chambered cairn in Orkney made a finding that quietly dismantled a story Scotland had been telling about itself for generations. The bones dated to around 3,800 BCE. The genetic profile that came back from the laboratory did not match what the accepted model predicted. Instead of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, the lineage of Scotland's Mesolithic inhabitants, the people who had lived on that land for thousands of years before farming arrived, the results showed ancestry almost entirely Anatolian in origin. Neolithic farmer ancestry, near total replacement levels, cross-referenced against the 2015 ancient genome work that had already begun rewriting Britain's prehistory. The Orkney finding was not an outlier. It was confirmation of something much harder to absorb. The skulls, the skeletal remains, the chambered tomb architecture, all of it pointed toward the same conclusion. This was not blending. This was erasure. And if Scotland had been replaced once, the question that follows is almost unbearable in its simplicity. How many times? For most of the 20th century, the accepted story of Scotland's deep past ran something like this. The Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who arrived after the last glaciation, perhaps 9 or 10,000 years ago, eventually encountered farming communities spreading westward from continental Europe. Over time, the two groups mixed. Farming was adopted, lifestyles changed. The population remained, more or less, continuous. This model was taught in schools, embedded in museum displays, and reproduced across popular histories. It was built on the best available evidence at the time: tool typologies, settlement patterns, changes in pottery styles, isotopic analysis of diet. All of it pointed toward a gradual cultural transition. The people, the assumption went, were largely the same people, only their way of life had changed. The model was reasonable. It was also built entirely before ancient DNA could test it. Ancient DNA has now tested it. The results came from paleogenomics laboratories across Europe, Copenhagen, Harvard, networks of researchers working with the Reich Lab's comparative frameworks, extracting and sequencing ancient genomes from burial contexts across Britain and Scotland specifically. What the sequences showed was not a gradient. It was not the blended ancestry pattern that gradual cultural diffusion would produce. Mesolithic British individuals carried Western hunter-gatherer ancestry at high levels. Neolithic individuals at the same geographic locations, sometimes buried within the same general landscape, carried almost exclusively Anatolian Neolithic ancestry. The overlap between the two populations, genetically speaking, was nearly zero. In Scotland's case, the transition looked genomically abrupt. The people changed faster than the stones did. That last detail matters more than it might initially seem. Skara Brae, the extraordinary Neolithic settlement on the Orkney mainland, dates to roughly 3,100 to 2,500 BCE. It is one of the best preserved Neolithic sites anywhere in the world. Its stone furniture, its connected passageways, its layered occupation history, all of it has made it a centerpiece of Scottish prehistoric identity. The site is routinely presented, in visitor centers and public-facing archaeology, as evidence of Scotland's earliest known settlers. And in one narrow sense, that framing is accurate. But genetic, the people who built Skara Brae were not descended from Scotland's actual earliest inhabitants. The Mesolithic people, the ones who had lived on that land for 5,000 years before the Neolithic population arrived, had left almost no genetic trace in the builders of those famous stone walls. The identity narrative attached to the monument is real. The monument itself is real. The people who built it were not a continuation of what came before. They were its replacement. That replacement is now the relatively settled part of the story. The harder part comes next. The Mesolithic population, carrying Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, leaving behind shell middens, lithic scatters, coastal campsites across thousands of years of occupation, essentially vanished from the genetic record within a few centuries of Neolithic arrival. Not absorbed, not gradually diluted, their signal nearly disappears. A population present for millennia does not quietly adopt farming and leave no descendants. The DNA says something more disruptive happened. Whether that disruption took the form of violence, epidemic disease, fertility collapse, or the slow pressure of demographic swamping remains genuinely unresolved. The fact of the replacement is measured, its mechanism is not. But this was only the first replacement. Around 2500 to 2000 BCE, another wave hit. The evidence for it is among the most dramatic findings in ancient genomics of the past decade. A 2018 paper published in Nature, led by researchers including David Reich's lab and Inigo Olalde, examined ancient DNA from bell beaker-associated burials across Britain. The results were striking. In Britain, the Neolithic Anatolian descended population, the same people who had replaced the Mesolithic inhabitants, the same people who built Skara Brae and Mai Shawe and the Ring of Brodgar, was itself largely displaced. This time, the incoming ancestry was steppe-derived, ultimately traceable to populations from the Pontic-Caspian steppe associated with the Yamnaya cultural complex. The transition is visible not only in the DNA, but in the physical record. Megalithic communal tomb burial gives way to individual inhumation, with bronze grave goods, amber beads, and new ceramic traditions appearing abruptly across the landscape. Scotland's genetic makeup had now been overwritten twice, within approximately 1500 years. That is not a pattern that fits models of gradual cultural exchange. After two near-total replacements, Scotland's genetic landscape looked almost nothing like its origins. The Bronze Age steppe ancestry population settled in, diversified, and eventually became the people Rome would encounter during its northern campaigns. And here the story enters one of its most argued chapters. The Picts, the Iron Age and early medieval inhabitants of Scotland, appearing clearly in the historical record from around 300 CE, have long carried an aura of mystery. Their symbol stones are among the most striking objects of early medieval northern Europe. Their language survives only in fragments. Their origins were debated for generations, with theories ranging from pre-Celtic indigenous survival to migration from elsewhere entirely. A 2023 study from researchers at the University of Aberdeen and Durham, drawing on the first confirmed ancient DNA from Pictish burial contexts, began to answer that question. The Picts, the results showed, were not a mysterious intrusion. Genomically, they showed continuity with earlier Iron Age and Bronze Age British populations. They were, essentially, the descendants of the Bell Beaker steppe ancestry people who had arrived 2 millennia earlier. This partially resolves the Pictish origin question, but it deepens another one considerably. If the Picts were genomically continuous with Bronze Age arrivals, then the people who raised those carved symbol stones, the people whose resistance to Roman expansion became the defining feature of northern Britain's early history, were themselves the descendants of a steppe-derived replacement event. The framing of Picts as ancient indigenous Scots, an identity layer carrying enormous cultural weight, is genomic displaced by approximately 1500 years from the actual first inhabitants. That is not a minor chronological adjustment, and it raises a question the genomic record alone cannot answer, which is where the story moves into stranger territory. The Pictish language survives only in Ogham inscriptions and fragmentary place names, and most of it has been classified as a P-Celtic Brittonic language, related to Welsh and Breton. But a subset of Pictish inscriptions has never been satisfactorily decoded using any known Celtic framework. Scholars including Kenneth Jackson and Catherine Forsyth have debated for decades whether a non-Indo-European substrate persisted into the Pictish period, remnants, possibly, of a pre-Bronze Age linguistic tradition that the steppe migrations failed to fully erase. The genomic record says the pre-steppe, pre-Indo-European population was largely replaced. The linguistic anomaly suggests the replacement may not have been complete in all regions, or that something was absorbed rather than eliminated. These two signals, genomic and linguistic, do not yet align into a clean explanation. The language may carry a ghost of a people the DNA says largely vanished. That is the part that refuses to fit. The monuments themselves push the question further. Callanish, on the Isle of Lewis, dates to around 2900 to 2600 BCE. Maeshowe, on Orkney, to approximately 2800 BCE. The Ring of Brodgar, to around 2500 BCE. These were built by the Anatolian Neolithic descended population, the second wave, already themselves a replacement of the original inhabitants. Within centuries of their construction, that population was displaced by the Bell Beaker arrivals. The monuments remain. The people who designed them, who understood whatever ritual or astronomical logic was encoded in their alignment and proportion, do not have living descendants in any dominant genetic line in modern Scotland. Consider what that means structurally. The most iconic prehistoric structures in Scotland were built by a population that has been genomically overwritten. The inheritance of those monuments passed to people who were not the heirs of their builders. It is structurally similar to what the evidence suggests happened in certain parts of pre-Columbian Americas. Populations that raised monumental architecture, collapsed or were displaced, and later arrivals inherited the physical landscape without inheriting the knowledge that shaped it. This is not an unprecedented kind of historical revision. In 1994, excavations at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey began exposing a site of organized monumental construction dating to approximately 9,600 BCE, more than 6,000 years before Stonehenge. Built by hunter-gatherers in a period when the standard model said such large-scale coordination should have been impossible. The site required revising the accepted timeline for when symbolic and architectural complexity could emerge. That revision was resisted, then accepted. The institutional pattern of resistance to destabilizing chronological findings is not unique to Scotland. It is a recurring feature of how prehistory gets revised. If the accepted story of when civilization-level organization begins was wrong by millennia in one case, the accepted story of who built Scotland's megalithic monuments and what happened to the knowledge embedded in those structures deserves the same scrutiny. What the genomic studies have produced is now replicable and not seriously disputed within the field. Modern Scots carry ancestry that reflects every layer of this layering process. Approximately 30 to 40% steppe Bronze Age ancestry, a similar proportion of Neolithic Anatolian ancestry, a residual 10 to 20% Western hunter-gatherer signal, plus later contributions from Norse, Anglo-Saxon, and Gaelic Irish populations. The national identity narrative of ancient, continuous Scottish ancestry is, genomically, a palimpsest, each layer partially overwriting the one before it. This is not a fringe finding. It has been published, replicated, and discussed across major genomics journals. What is striking is how little of it has entered public Scottish historical consciousness, school curricula, or the interpretive frameworks of heritage sites. The gap between what the DNA shows and what the cultural narrative repeats is itself worth noticing. There is also a deeper problem with the evidence. The genomic sampling of Scottish ancient DNA remains incomplete, particularly for the Western Isles, the far northwest Highlands, and certain island communities where preservation conditions and land access have limited excavation. Some physical anthropology work has noted features in skeletal populations from geographically marginal regions that might suggest partial survival of pre-Neolithic lineages. Preliminary findings, contested, not yet genomically confirmed. Absence of sequencing from a region is not the same as evidence that no survivors existed there. The conclusions currently drawn from Orkney, Lothian, and southern Scotland may not represent the full genomic picture of the entire region. The most undersampled areas of Scotland are also, notably, the areas with the most persistent folk traditions, the most archaic linguistic features, and the most unusual concentrations of material culture anomalies. That convergence has not been unexplained. The symbolic record presses the question even harder. Cup and ring marks appear across Neolithic sites built by one population. Spiral forms, concentric circle motifs, and the specific astronomical orientation logic built into passage tombs appear to echo, however faintly, in Pictish artistic traditions produced by a genomically distinct population centuries later. Three possible explanations exist. The recurrence reflects independent convergence. Two populations, separated by millennia, independently arriving at the same symbolic language. Or it reflects partial cultural transmission through survivor groups, pockets of the earlier population, too small to register clearly in the genomic average, who passed down something of what they knew. Or it reflects the reuse of older sites by later populations who encountered the monuments, observed their alignments, and incorporated something of their logic without fully understanding its origin. None of these explanations has been confirmed. The genomic record shows replacement. The symbolic record hints at continuity. These two signals have not been reconciled, and the gap between them is the most interesting unresolved space in Scottish prehistory, which returns everything finally to May Show. At midwinter solstice, for a window of a few days around the winter solstice, a single shaft of light enters the long entrance passage of Maeshowe and illuminates the back wall of the inner chamber with precision that is not accidental. The alignment was intentional. It was built, calculated, encoded into the structure at the time of construction around 2800 BCE. The people who designed it understood the relationship between the movement of the sun, the geometry of the chamber, and whatever meaning that moment of light in the dark was meant to hold. They are, genomically, absent from the modern population. Their astronomical knowledge has no confirmed transmission chain. The structure survives, the people do not. And several of Scotland's chambered cairns, including sections of Maeshowe's deeper interior context, have not been fully excavated, not because of disinterest, but because of preservation rules, structural fragility, and the irreversible nature of opening what has been sealed. What remains inside those sealed spaces might be symbolic, it might be genomic, it might be material evidence that would push the story further back or wider out than anything the record currently allows. Scotland has been overwritten at least 3 times that the ancient DNA can currently show. The question is not whether more layers exist. The question is whether the methods, the access, and the willingness to pursue the full implications of what has already been found will arrive before the sites are closed. The bones are repatriated without sequencing, and the record is sealed once more, this time not by the earth, but by us.